So our presentation is Status of Minorities in South Asia. And then here's the basic rundown of our outline. And then like it says, let us know if you guys have any questions. Feel free to interrupt during the presentation. And we're going to start with our first section.
Okay, so let me introduce the regional corporations to you. Here are the definitions. Regional cooperation refers to the political and institutional mechanisms that countries in a general geographical region devise to fend and strengthen common interests, as well as promoting their national interests through mutual cooperation and dialogue. The definition of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation is it is an economic and geopolitical organization that was established to promote socio-economic development, stability, and welfare economics, and collective self-reliance within its member nations. Founded during a summit in 1985, SAARC's initial members include Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Due to rapid expansion within the region, Afghanistan received full member status, and countries are considered observers. SAARC respects the principles of sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and national independence as it strives to attain sustainable economic growth. Next slide, please. The growth of regional corporations depends on the willingness of the political leaders, and the political leaders' willingness depends greatly on the payoff of regional corporations. The most valuable payoff is to retain political power. So how to retain political power? They need adequate domestic support. The biggest part of domestic support is come from elite level support. The reason is mass publics generally unconcerned about regional corporations. However, elites concerned about it. They remain interested and involved in the formation of regional cooperation policies. In addition, they also have potential to influence the policies, such as they have the capability to politicize issues, mobilize masses, and even increases saliency of a particular issue by means of debates, media writing, and discussion. Next slide, please. The elite structure is also different. In India and Sri Lanka, functional elites act as interest groups, lobbying to secure certain goals. In other times, they act as little groups who must be placated before a given policy can be implemented. In other SAARC countries, like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Maldives, where the elite structure remains tightly integrated to a varying degree, few functional elite, such as the military, industrial, and landed elite, they have access to power and wealth. In such a system, a leader may have more autonomy in the policy-making process. Next slide. And the nature of elite preferences is basically from two parts, utilitarian evaluation and effective allegiance. The utilitarian evaluation of elites are determined by their perception of benefits, economic security, social welfare, and so on from a specific regional cooperative arrangement. And effective allegiances of elites are based on their shared values, attachment, sympathy, and trust toward regional organizations. Next slide. The scholar's opinion is different about which kind of support, effective or utilitarian, precedes the other. According to functionists and neo-functionists, they think utilitarian support precedes effective support because rewards and gains are said to be prerequisites for trust and confidence. On the contrary, communitarian scholars argue that existence of effective support precedes utilitarian support. They think trust and confidence are the prerequisites for the growth of economic transaction between member countries of a regional grouping. Effective support is abstract and broad in nature. Also, to tap the affective dimension of support, the respondents were asked questions on South Asia identity, solidarity, and the national image. And next, my group members will talk about it specifically.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Next slide, please. So I'm talking about South Asian identity and solidarity. To evaluate the nature of the South Asian domestic elite level support along the effective and utilitarian dimension toward SARC, there is a research for 780 elite from 5 countries over a period of 2 years. Since the effective support is kind of abstract, which represent elite emotion attachment of regional identity and community, then the responders were asked questions on South Asian identity, solidarity, and national image. For identity and solidarity, the questions focus on the degree of unit that their willingness to undergo economic sacrifice for the sake of other SARC members. For the national image, which evaluate respondents' attitude to the neighboring countries, such as military aggression, political stability, economic dependency, and more. The questions of evaluation of membership look at the satisfaction with SARC achievement and their favorable on the issues of expansion of regional cooperation in South Asia. The questions on perception of inequality evaluate respondents' perception of their country's related contribution to and benefit from SARC arrangement. Over this all, responses to this question represent elite's perspective from the current stage of regional cooperation arrangement and their perspective of likely benefit from the future economic arrangement between SARC members. Next one, please. Yep. So here is a table about the result of South Asian identity and solidarity. It provides a comparison of national percentage of positive response to the questions in 5 countries. When asked about their sense of South Asian identity, the highest percentage with positive answer appeared in Nepal and Sri Lanka, which is more than 1/3 of the respondents. Then there are less than 1/4 of the respondents in Bangladesh identity with their South Asian identity. However, only less than 1/5 of the respondents in India and 1/8 about the respondents in Pakistan indicate themselves as citizens of South Asia. As we know, the India and Pakistan are larger than others. This data represent the regional identity of the elite who is in India and Pakistan less more than their counterparts in smaller South Asian countries. Could you please click once. Yeah, look at this two data. Next slide, please. For the question on similarity, the percentage of the India, Nepal, and Bangladesh are very close, only around 1/4. Even in Pakistan, there is less than 1/5 of the respondents are prepared to make a personal sacrifice to help another SARC member state experiencing economic difficulties. The highest percentage appear in Sri Lanka, slightly fewer than 1/2. This result indicates that existence of low level of effective support among South Asia elite for the growth of regional cooperation. Only a small amount elite identify with their South Asia identity and are willing to help other as AARC member state. Well, this attitude among elite from economic weaker countries are understandable. Same attitude among India and Pakistan elite remains problematic for the growth of SAARC. This result has important implications for evaluating the progress of SARC. First, this low level of effective sentiment is hardly encouraging for South Asian policymakers to push for deeper regional cooperation policies. Second one, this low level of effective attachment among the elite indicate their strong national political loyalties and lack of development of any supranational identity and elegances. Finally, such as this environment of this is hard conducive for the growth of regional institutions. Yeah, next one.
Okay, I will talk about the national image first. Next slide, please. Policies supporting regional cooperation are more likely to receive domestic support when people in a country perceive neighboring countries positive and favorably. When people of one country have positive image or good feeling about another country, they tend to develop an identity support to regional cooperation policies. Several studies suggest that people have negative image of a country when it is perceived as aggressively militaristic, authoritarian, economically dependent, and more external oriented. On the other hand, when a country is perceived as politically stable, economically and industrially developed, and friendly toward neighbor, people are likely to have positive image of that country. Next slide, please. This table provides a comparison of the national percentage of positive response to the question on national images. We can see from this table there are 5 attributes of neighboring countries: aggressively militaristic, authoritarian, economically dependent, political stability, external orientation. Next slide, please. This result indicates an absence of positive perception of national image of India and Sri Lanka were viewed at least authoritarian, because about 3/4 of the respondents described India and about 1/2 of the respondents described Pakistan as aggressively militaristic. India and Sri Lanka were viewed at least authoritarian. Except Pakistan, other South Asian countries were also viewed at least authoritarian. For economic strength and weakness, India was considered as economically and industrially most developed. Next to the Indian, Sri Lanka was considered as less economically dependent for the political stability, except for Sri Lanka. All other South Asian countries were considered by more than a majority of the respondents as politically unstable. For the external orientation, slightly less than one half of respondents view India as external oriented. External orientation is a detrimental factor of the growth of the regionalism. It's evident from the high score of the external orientation that respondents do not consider South Asian countries as very supportive of the idea of regional cooperation. Next slide, please. There is the summary of the national image. The most important thing is that making deeper cooperation in terms of institutional development extremely problematic. Next slide, please. Now I will talk about the perception of inequity. That is, people's perception that their country is likely to contribute more than it receives from a regional organization, appears to be related to their attitudinal support for a regional organization. In the context of perception of inequity, four special questions were asked: which member country benefit most, benefit least, contribute most, and contribute least? Next slide, please. The following table provides a comparison of respondent perception of inequity. This assessment seems to be based on India's relative larger economic size. However, most Indian respondents disagree with this assessment. Indian perception of inequity may not lead to formation of negative attitude towards South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation over the long run. People's indifference to South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation is not conducive to its development. Next slide, please. Few South Asians thought that their own country would be likely to benefit most from South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation and contribute least to South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. However, after Pakistan was viewed by large number of respondents from India, Sri Lanka are likely to contribute least. This attitude of indifference by the both Pakistan and Indian elite boosts ill for the growth of South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which need active support from both India and Pakistan to succeed. Next slide, please.
Alrighty. Hi guys, I'm going to be going over evaluation of Saarc membership from each of the specific members. And so when we think about Saarc membership as a whole and how the members of Saarc have voted on the perception of their own individual membership of Saarc, the number one most positive aspect of the membership is simply the recurring meeting and ability to hold and host informal discussion between nations. This is credited greatly with easing geopolitical tensions, and there's a couple concrete examples that lead to this example. Operation Brass Tacks, which was basically an Indian military display of force on the northwestern border of the Indo-Pakistan border, was essentially eased down through the second Saarc summit, just through a series of informal talks and negotiation. The Tamil problem focuses on the Sri Lankan civil war, where India stepped in and intervened to help essentially quell a civil war of what we would consider terrorists within Sri Lanka. And the Saarc summit, I believe it was number 11, was credited with facilitating the quelling of the Tamil problem. Another concrete example would be Pakistani intervention with the JKLF, which is the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Force, So the government of Pakistan stopped the JKLF from entering the ceasefire line in Kashmir, which is, as we'll discuss later, a highly contested zone between Pakistan and India, which is essentially a product of claimed property from both sovereignties. And the Pakistani government is credited greatly with essentially diffusing a situation that would have heightened geopolitical tensions even greater. And then the handshake is between I believe it's the president of Pakistan and the prime minister of India, again at a Saarc summit that essentially led into a new series of talks and discussions between the two countries where there previously had been a bit of a stalemate politically. And so this graph will show you the exact sort of voting initiatives. And so you can see, like I said, number one, regular meetings is credited with the greatest positive benefit of Saarc membership. And then below that, we see cultural, technical, and scientific cooperation, and then free trade initiatives within the region. It's interesting here, and I wanted to point out that simply the regular meetings is credited with number one. And so the cultural, technical, and scientific cooperations and the free trade initiatives are taking a back seat to basic geopolitical relations here. And if we compare that to basically multinational, multi-regional organizations globally, this isn't the case. You see that typically we're working on science, technology, free trade, basic things that benefit, you could say everyday people, but that might be a bit of a misstatement to say that free trade affects the everyday person. But that's a conversation for something else. And then further to look at this, you can see our internal versus external threat assessment. So you can see, again, the regular meetings are going to help quell our geopolitical tensions. But then you can see at the very bottom of the list here, terrorism and drug trafficking are by far the lowest positive benefits seen by Saarc members, which is probably in exact opposite to something like NATO, which we'll talk about later, which is sort of collectively united against like the threat of Russia, for example. And so the other part of, part of the free trade agreements that we've talked about previously, you can see that here, so India and Sri Lanka desire a greater free trade agreement, but that's because they're sort of in cahoots. Sri Lanka sort of depends on India because it's an island off of the coast of India. And you can see low support from Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, which stems from giving India too much economic influence in their regions. This will be a recurring theme, but essentially India is considered maybe not a bully, but a bit of maybe too strong of a force in the region. And so when we think about South Asia, it's typically referred to as the Indian subcontinent. And so on the graph here, you can see these are the most voted on negative issues that hinder the growth of Saarc. And so the biggest one being the Indo-Pakistan conflict, which again is noted for being essentially holding back the region as a whole. These are the two largest nations, the two greatest economic influences here. And their continual butting heads over the, centuries at this point, has really stopped the region from being able to sort of collectively unite. And then when you add into that the fear of Indian domination based on their economic size, based on the landmass, and based on their relations with the outside world, it adds into, you can see number one and number two are based on big primary Indian concerns in terms of their influence and reach over the region. The other negative effects here, few concrete achievements, unresolved bilateral disputes, competition between members. These are again a result of that lack of solidarity between the nations. A lot of this stuff and a lot of the smaller countries basically intend to see India as a facilitator of the rest of the region. And as you saw earlier, India sees itself as already doing too much for the region. and for the other members of Saarc. And so we're in a sort of a stalemate where India thinks it's doing too much and the rest of the nations don't think it's doing enough. And then you add in Indo-Pakistan conflict, and you can see why Saarc membership as a whole is sort of not going anywhere very fast. And this will be sort of a representation of what I'm talking about. So you can see here, India by far largest landmass, with the basically the greatest border space here, and the most access to shipping routes, and access to naval ports. Add in all of that population, which ties into economics, GDP production, that kind of stuff. And you can see why India is sort of the crown jewel of South Asia here. And because of that, like I discussed, the Saarc response to Indian influence is pretty negative. Most of the countries have unresolved bilateral issues, and that's sort of going to be a natural consequence of the size here. Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, they can't really force concessions with India just based on their dependence on Indian markets, Indian exports, Indian imports, that kind of thing. And collectively, the rest of the countries still don't have enough pressure or the incentive to work together to force India into a better like conciliation, essentially. And as you'll notice here, so Pakistan is in between Afghanistan and India, and it's a long-running issue that India tends to make or align itself militaristically with bordering countries of Pakistan to sort of strong-arm Pakistan into its own wishes. But because of this, Pakistan doesn't really want to necessarily work with anyone else because they have a specific sort of retribution against India. And then, so this is going to talk about Saarc membership attitudes on the expansion of the program and its initiatives within South Asia. And so you can see here, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka all have basically a 40% greater favor rate. And if you'll notice, India and Pakistan, again, the two greatest powers here, are both lower. This makes sense. These countries are going to rely on the larger nations. And like I said, India and Pakistan are sort of the two front runners for the area. And as you can see, India and Pakistan, they're sort of hesitant to push towards expansion of the Saarc program, relies heavily on their mistrust of each other. Neither one is willing to give cards over to the other, simply because of the long-standing rivalry. And like I said, we'll talk about the Kashmir and essentially the boundary line debates that continue to really stress their geopolitical relations. And so to wrap up, as we look at Saarc membership as a whole, you can see the obvious cases where geopolitical tensions can be lessened are great. They're a good thing for all people involved. And the free trade initiatives are generally something that developing nations are looking to push for interregionally. But as far as moving Saarc and the Saarc program and Saarc initiatives ahead, it tends to be muddled with mistrust, and it's not going anywhere very fast. Again, this is going to look like Indian and Pakistan longstanding rivalry, India's general landmass and economic domination of the region continues to force, like I said, unfair market exchange between the smaller nations interregionally. And then further than that, even the genuinely positive Saarc relations and Saarc initiatives are typically cut short by prior interregional deals or alliances. This is going to be what I talked about with Sri Lanka and India. They have close ties because of the geographical proximity. Like I said, Sri Lanka is an island off the coast of India. They rely heavily on India. And so they've already made deals. They're willing to cut more deals. And so they don't necessarily need the larger Saarc picture to intervene on their behalf because they're already benefiting from the #1 power in the region. So as a whole, it seems like Saarc membership has some bright points and some obvious benefits for all nations involved. But basically, the geopolitical relations of the area, based both on landmass and historical events like the split of Pakistan and India, continue to hold back interregional cooperation as a whole. It's not going anywhere very fast, but you can start to see the steps and the infrastructure that may lead to further progression. And then I'm going to switch to Dr.
I will talk about the South Asian Community and the South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation. Next slide, please. Nationalist bias and the lack of regional outlook among South Asians. I will focus on India and Pakistan. The considerable less positive attitude of India and Pakistan toward the South Asia community is a reflection of their deep divide caused by history and continually political tension. There is summary of three main historical issues during India and Pakistan. Partition in 1947. By the time the British left in 1947, they had divided the colony into a predominantly Hindu Indian and Muslim East and West Pakistan. According to conservative estimates, about 500,000 Hindu and Muslim were slaughtered, live in both countries with deep psychological and political scar. In Kashmir issue, both India and Pakistan still claim Kashmir in its entirety. Ceasefire agreement in 2003 remains in place, but both countries often accuse each other of violating it. India's role in the partition of Pakistan in 1971, when people of East Pakistan started hitting from West Pakistan and create an uncertain situation, and that was united by Indian government very properly. They start to develop diplomatical, political, economical, and logistical support to the people of East Pakistan. Next slide, please. There are some information about the history of India and Pakistan. Yeah, please play the video.
Partition was bloody.
Communal hatred flares up in the Punjab. 1 million people become refugees overnight. They flee from savagery and butchery that has never been exceeded, even in India's stormy history.
Amid the chaos, some princely states were given the choice to join either country. In most cases, the ruling monarchs followed the will of their people. But this state, called Jammu and Kashmir, was different. It was right along this new border and had a Muslim-majority population, but was ruled by a Hindu monarch. When asked to pick a side, the ruler chose to stay neutral. Fearing that the monarch would join India, the Kashmiri population rebelled here in 1947. Armed tribesmen from Pakistan soon joined the fight. The monarch turned to India for military help and in exchange agreed to join them, which sparked the First Indo-Pakistan War in Kashmir.
Continuing thus increased the threat to world peace and brought the dispute to the attention of the United Nations.
The UN Security Council brokered a ceasefire in 1949, which established this line, with Pakistan controlling this side and India this one. It also asked Pakistani tribesmen to withdraw and Indian troops to follow so that Kashmir could hold a direct vote to decide its own future. But neither held up their end of the deal. Pakistan argued that Kashmir's Muslim-majority population rightfully belonged with them, while India insisted that Kashmir was handed over to them by the Hindu monarch, so they doubled down and added Kashmir to their constitution. The vote was never held.
I think every person in Kashmir has been affected by India and Pakistan.
The Kashmir is completely destroyed by India as well as by Pakistan.
This is a territorial dispute, they call it. They don't need people.
The main stakeholders are the Kashmiris. Their opinions are not being heard.
Both countries continued to tighten their grip around it for decades.
Kashmir, fighting is going on, and heavy casualties in men and equipment have been inflicted on the aggressor.
In 1965, the Second Indo-Pakistan War broke out in Kashmir. Thousands of people were killed between the huge armies on both sides. A ceasefire ended the war, but didn't change this line. Kashmir was kept divided and occupied. And another war broke out in 1971. This time the focus wasn't in Kashmir, it was in East Pakistan. Here, India helped rebels fight for independence and dealt Pakistan a devastating defeat. This region became a new country, Bangladesh, and Pakistan lost its eastern half. This made Kashmir more important than ever. It became one of the most militarized places on Earth as India and Pakistan deployed planes, tanks, artillery, and soldiers along the line of control. On the political front, in '87, India reportedly rigged an election, declaring a pro-India party as the winner. Now, this was a big turning point for many Kashmiris, who felt they were again denied the chance to vote. Thousands took to the streets in Indian-controlled Kashmir to protest the occupation. But India met the movement for independence with harsh resistance, which quickly escalated.
Next slide. South Asians are less inclined to support their neighboring countries in times of economic difficulties. South Asia shows a low sense of solidarity with each other. First, indifferences in the nature of individual state preoccupation with domestic issues, lack of cross-border travel, less or negative press coverage of South Asian affairs, distorted history textbooks, and limited interaction among South Asians. Government has influenced to varying degrees South Asia's attitude toward each other. South Asia countries are hardly encouraged for the development of the transnational entity. Most South Asian islands view their neighbors negatively. Positive perception of India was neutralized when most South Asians describe India as aggressively militaristical. This indicates a widespread distrust toward India's role in the region. Most South Asia has negative views about Pakistan, such as authoritarian political stability and external orientation. Bangladesh and Nepal were viewed neither economical developed, neither political stable. South Asia are less positive inclined toward the development of South Asia community. Next slide, please. The high degrees of perceived inequities that India would contribute most but benefit less. The extent of perceived inequality to varying degree among South Asian islands, along with lack of concrete achievement of South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation, appear to be associated with their relative indifferences toward it. This remains worrisome and obvious. Requires most effort from South Asia policymakers to convince their people that membership in South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation is worthwhile. They gain some benefit in this organization's role in promoting confidence-building process in regional. The disappointment about its lack of concrete achievement in more silent issues like trade and security into Pakistan antagonism low level of inter-regional trade over the past decade that has also contributed to low level of utilitarian support for South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. Next slide.
The finding of all revolve that domestic elite support for SAARC along effective and utilitarian dimensions remain limited. There are two important implications for the growth of regional cooperation in South Asia. First one is absence of the strong positive. Since there is since the absence of the strong positive elite support for SARC, then it contributes to the depending of weakening of commitment among the South Asian policymakers for broader regional cooperative initiative and implementation of various regional agreements. Then, the regional cooperation's growth has remained slow over the past 20 years. The existence of weak governments in South Asia and the ruling coalition's needs for domestic support for political survival, lack of strong domestic support, doubled has contributed to the policymakers' inertia towards South Asia Association for the Regional Cooperation. And another one important implication is South Asia elite expect that SAARC has important consequence for South Asia's political and economic welfare related to trade, security, and regional peace and stability. In fact, SARC's field concentrate achievement in the area of trade, security, and regional peace are linked to its credibility gap. As many elite pointed that SARC-related rhetoric has generic outdistanced SARC's performance. Other past several years, as long as this credibility gap continues, social actors' difference toward this organization will persist. This indifferences does not indicate the format of negative attitude. Rather, it suggests that societal actors may not be strong catalysts and advocate for regional cooperation. It provides governing elite with an acquiescent domestic environment in which to pursue regional cooperation policies. Next one, please. Be pervised about SARC's utilitarian value. Here is a table about the attitude toward the expansion of the regional cooperation in South Asia. As we can see, fewer respondents actually hold the opposite idea. And if we take the variable and donut together, the first line and the third line together, we can expect that most people do well in SARC to perform better, which means the elite indifference also suggests that majority of South Asia's elite could be persuaded about SARC's utilitarian value by changing secret system and new information about the achievement. All in all, the prevailing indifference of societal actors can be transformed into great utilitarian sport for SARC with a show if more positive results of SARC in the area of trade and security. Ethics analysis indicate two major factors remain the major obstacle for the growth of SARC. Can you click to the next one, please? Indo-Pakistan's political tension and the general fear of India's overwhelming military and economic domination remain the major obstacles for the growth of SARC. Let's talk about the first one, Indo-Pakistan conflicts. As we discussed about the adverse impact of Indo-Pacific conflict on the growth of SARC, the continued conflicting between these two countries contribute greatly to the negative evaluation of by South Asia's domestic elite. Unless the conflict be weakened, the perspectives will not gain much lift. Resolution of Indo-Pacific conflict and some active positive unilateral economic initiatives by India toward its neighbors to overcome their fear can serve as driving force that could galvanize South Asian governments to move ahead with regional cooperation effort. And next one is economic domination. While the regional political tension will take time to resolve, economic issue creates some urgency for the cooperation. Then the deepening regional cooperation is as a potential important political tool for many South Asian countries to help address conflict in the region and address political tension with India. On the other hand, in the governing elite seem to have found some positive utilitarian economic initiatives. They found several positive ways, such as opening its market to the South Asian neighbors through professional trade agreement and some restraints on its freedom of action may be an acceptable price for reassuring the neighborhood that its growth strength is not a stress for its neighbors, kind of like that. While this above scenario is promising for SARC growth, they still have several problems with need them to be more active on their cooperation. That's all we have for domestic preference for regional cooperation. Cross-national cooperation. Here's the next one. Here's the reference, and thank you for listening.